Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to my presentation on the Holy Land. In the beginning of April 1st to 10th, I had the opportunity to go on a pilgrimage with another parish. They're in need of a priest, and so they asked me, and I was able to do it. This is actually my second time to the Holy Land. I went during my time in seminary, during the third year. All of us go together, and so I actually combined those two trips into this slideshow, and I have some pictures from my first trip and some pictures from my second trip. So the goals of my presentation today, the first goal, there's so much that could be talked about. I can't talk about all of it, so I'm just going to hone it in. First, giving a sense of the geography of the Bible. And then the second is to help you kind of picture the scenes of the Bible. So I focus more on those places that kind of help you do that versus other places that they might be important sites, but in pictures they're not as useful. So let's just start out with the general geography of the Holy Land. Where is the Holy Land? Well, it's in the Middle East. So we've got Africa to the south, down here, Europe up here, and Asia here. As you can imagine, this point was a very important point in ancient history because it's the crossroads between three continents. You can't go over here, that's a desert. And so you have to go alongside here, and I'll zoom in a little bit further. There's a little bit closer to the Holy Land. I'll zoom in a little bit closer, and you'll notice this is the River Nile Delta. So this is Egypt right here. So that's obviously a very important place in the desert. The Israelites went from Egypt, crossed through the Red Sea down here, and walked up through the desert for 40 years. Not much to eat there, that's why they needed the manna. And now here, see this green? This is the Holy Land. Zoom in a little bit further. Up at the top in the north, that's the Sea of Galilee. Down in the south, this huge lake, that is the Dead Sea. Lowest point on Earth, 1,400 feet below sea level up here. And so, obviously, the land slopes down very steeply in this area. Rivers flow into the Dead Sea, but no rivers flow out of the Dead Sea. That's why it's so full of minerals and salt, because the water evaporates, leaving all the minerals in the Dead Sea with no place to go. Between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea is the Jordan River. And so the Israelites actually went up to the east and crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Somewhere, I don't know where, but somewhere across the Jordan River. Here's the modern map of Israel, of the Holy Land. See Egypt here, Saudi Arabia over here, Syria to the north. It's a very small area. I have that in another slide. Okay, here's an ancient map of the Bible, of the Holy Land. Jerusalem is down here, kind of by the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee, again, up here, Jordan River in between. The distance between the Sea of Galilee and Jerusalem is 75 miles directly as the crow flies, to give you a sense. So if you're walking, that's a pretty long ways, but if you're driving, that's a very short ways. So that gives you a sense of how big the Holy Land is. Minnesota, by the way, is 400 miles from north to south. So we're dealing with a very small section of Minnesota if we compare the two, the Holy Land and Minnesota. So let's start out with kind of where Jesus starts off, in Nazareth. This is the place of the Annunciation, where the angel declared to Mary, "You will be the mother of the Son of the Most High." So where's Nazareth? That's up here in the northern area, kind of near the Sea of Galilee. And here is a video of one of the excavations of Nazareth. And so the Nazareth, is a small village. They lived in kind of cave-like buildings. I don't know if they were dug out of the ground or if they were like made with mud. I'm not sure, but they were cave-like dwellings. And so hopefully this will play. Here's a short video. This is under the Church of the Annunciation and the excavations. And so this is a house from the 1st century. It's kind of broken now, but that's what it was like. Sorry if I'm standing in the way. Okay, just a short video. Here is a picture of what their houses were like. So you see a cave and you see a cellar where you put like food and stuff like that, and then sometimes even another cellar beneath that. So you literally climb in and get your, I don't know, wheat, grain, or whatever. So Nazareth, a poor city, a poor town, very small, not a large town at all. Now it's one of the largest Arab cities in the whole Holy Land. It's huge, but back then a very small village. Here is the altar, which is in what is reputed to be the house of Mary. I'm not 100% clear on my history of this particular site, but we have some evidence that indicates at least that this is the house that Mary lived in, and therefore probably the house that she was in when the angel appeared to her, announced to her that she would be the mother of God. And therefore, this is the place where the Word became flesh. So, as we see this altar, it says the words verbum caro hic factum est. Verbo means word. Factum est means was made. Caro, like carne or carnivore, means flesh. But the word that's very important about this altar that's different than other altars in the world is the word hic, here. The Word was made flesh here. And so a very powerful place that God, when He became man, when He became one of us, it wasn't just in general. There had to be a particular place in which it happened because we are particular beings that have time and place. And so, because of this, God really has come to dwell among us, like us in all things. And so it's a very special place. So how, in general, in the Holy Land, how do we know that these are the real sites? You know, is this just medieval lore or something that got passed down to us? How do we know? Well, we actually know quite a bit most of the time. But it depends on the site. Some sites are more credible than others. But regardless of this, there's a frequent pattern in the Holy Land that the churches follow that helps us trace the history back from our time to the time of Jesus. And here's how it usually goes. Right now, usually there's modern churches built in the 1900s. Those churches are built on top of Crusader churches built in usually the 1100s. So that takes care of at least 900, 800 years. The Crusaders built those churches on top of Byzantine churches. The Byzantine churches were built usually in the 300s, sometimes 400s or 500s. That's when Christianity became legal, and when Constantine's mother, St. Helen, traveled from Rome. I don't know if it was Rome at the time or if it was Constantinople, but either way, traveled to the Holy Land as a Christian. She was a devout Christian mother. Constantine, he is Christian, but not so devout. She located these sites with the help of the Christians currently living in the area. And so they built churches, big churches, in the 300s on the most important sites. And we still have those ruins, those excavations of those churches. And sometimes those churches were built on even pre-built sites. So, for example, in Capernaum, which we will see, there was a house church that predated the 300s. So the 100s or the 200s, Christians were coming to that particular house church in Capernaum and venerating there. It was a special place that we know from archaeological excavations that they visited. And so that narrows the time gap to quite a near time to the time of Jesus. In that case, for example, we're dealing with people visiting that place when their grandparents or great-grandparents were alive during the time of the apostles. Don't be too skeptical about early Christian traditions. Why? Because Christians lived here during this early Christian history, and of course would have visited these places and told their children where these most holy places were. Wouldn't you? People are the same now. We want to visit places. Back then, they visited places too. Even in the Old Testament, the actual site was very important. You know, Moses did this here. He built this monument here. Da 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 da. Okay. Back to Nazareth. We read in the Gospel of Luke. The people of Nazareth rose up, drove Jesus out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town had been built, to hurl him down headlong. But he escaped. Well, here's the hill. Here's the hill on which Nazareth was built. It's the precipice. And just for fun, we figured we'd throw our fellow seminarian, Father Chad Van Hurst, off of the cliff. Imitation of Jesus. Bethlehem. They'll just a brief talking about Bethlehem. Bethlehem is back down by Jerusalem, so kind of the Dead Sea-ish area. When Bethlehem is a very important church because it's one of the only churches that wasn't destroyed in the Middle Ages. As we know, there's Holy Land is a place of conflict. For example, the Muslims conquered it. They weren't Muslims yet when this happened, but when in the 600s, when most of those churches were destroyed, they were I forget which group, the Persians. The Persians destroyed most of the churches, and then the Crusaders conquered the place back in the 1100s, and then it was taken over again. Anyway, complex history. But this church wasn't destroyed. Why? Probably because it was the one church that had Middle Eastern people in the mosaic on the wall. Persians, the Magi, the Bethlehem. So they saw that on the wall and said, oh, maybe we shouldn't destroy this church. Our forefathers were here at this site. And so this church is special because I think it's the oldest church still standing in the Holy Land, the church in Bethlehem. Another special thing about this church is that this is the only entrance into the church. For security and reasons a long time ago, it was the door was made small so that for fortification reasons. But they left it small. Why? Because if you want to visit the place of Jesus, you have to bend down. You have to humble yourself to recognize Jesus. And so that's the doorway in. So here's what the cave of Bethlehem actually looks like now. Most of it's protected, so you can't graffiti it and scratch your name into the walls and that sort of thing. But this is the site, and there's good historical reason that this is the site. I'm not super clear on the details, but St. Jerome, for example, lived in the caves of Bethlehem because he wanted to live in the place where Jesus was born. The Sea of Galilee, one of my favorite places in the Holy Land. Back up to the Sea of Galilee, you'll see kind of how it's shaped. Longer than it is wide. It's shaped like a harp. Its other name, that's the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Gennesareth. I think Gennesareth means harp, something like that, because it's shaped like a harp. But anyway, Nazareth down here, Capernaum up here, which we'll talk about later. The Sea of Galilee is 13 miles long by 8 miles wide. And so very large, not as big as Mille Lacs, but still very large. It's comparable to Mille Lacs. Mille Lacs, I think, is like 20 miles long or something like that. Not much bigger than that. But you can see across the Sea of Galilee from every point of the shore as long as it's a clear day. So here it is. Here's the Sea of Galilee. We got to take a boat trip from Tiberias to kind of near Capernaum, which is the route that Jesus probably often would have taken, kind of northeastern part where the Jewish people lived, kind of back and forth. And so here's what it looks like. So they played kind of cheesy music on the boat, but here it is. Okay, and then a view from the side of the boat. Nearing the shore, what we're looking at is kind of the area of the Mount of the Beatitudes, where Jesus spoke the Beatitudes. So you can imagine, so it says, for example, in one place, he went up to the top of a mountain and preached this. And then in another place it says, he went to a plain and preached this. Well, it could have been the same place because those are kind of mountains with flat tops, basically. But you can also imagine Jesus going to the tops of those hills to go out by himself to pray. Kind of a hazy day, so visibility isn't great, but at least it's okay. It took us a half hour in this boat going this speed to get from Tiberias to Capernaum, which just so see Magdala right here, and then Capernaum right here. Tiberias is down here, Capernaum up here. It took us a half hour going. I don't know. I bet we were booking it at least 10 miles an hour, way faster than you can paddle. But like a canoe can only go like 3 miles an hour, and so they had to paddle bigger boats than canoes. So I'd imagine it. That's why it took all night to paddle from one part of the lake to the other, especially if the wind is not in your favor. Here is actually a boat that was excavated from the 1st century, so from around the time of Jesus. The sea level in the Sea of Galilee was low one year, and they saw this partially sticking out of the mud, and they found it and they excavated it, and so now this is what a boat would have looked like during the time of Jesus. Capernaum, one of my favorite places along the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is a very important place. Why? Jesus lived there for a while. It says in the Gospel of Matthew, he left Nazareth and went to live in Capernaum by the sea. Why did he live there? Well, probably this is why. The hometown of at least 4 apostles: Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John, all from Capernaum. I think Peter was from Bethsaida, but his mother-in-law lived in Capernaum, and so when he got married, he must have moved to Capernaum. Matthew/Levi worked at the tax booth along the sea nearby Capernaum. This is where Matthew was called. So that's 5 apostles that have very close connections to Capernaum. So pretty big deal. Also the place that the paralytic was lowered through the roof. And then finally, this is where Jesus gave the I am the bread of life discourse in John chapter 6 in the synagogue. So here we are standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and we're going to take a walk up to the excavations at Capernaum, which was excavated in the 1900s, so very recent. It was lost to history mostly before that, because just wars happen and places get abandoned and they get filled in with mud and erosion and whatever. But now they've excavated a large part of the town, and so we have the foundations of that, and they found something very special there, which we'll talk about. So here we are along the Sea of Shore of Galilee. So Jesus would have called the apostles along the shore somewhere near here, because this is where they lived. Their boat's not going to be on the other side of the lake. It's going to be near here. Okay. There's a little bit of algae today because the wind was blowing this direction, but it's not always that algae. So now we're going to speed up the video because it would take too long, but we're going to walk up into the city of Capernaum. Kind of sound like chipmunks. Okay, and now here is the house, presumably of St. Peter, where Jesus probably lived. And I'll tell you a little bit why we think that in a little bit. That octagon structure, that's actually a church built in the Byzantine period, built on a house church from an earlier period before Christianity was the religion of the Roman Empire. So here's the foundation walls of Capernaum. Presumably the upper parts of the walls are made of materials that deteriorate, like wood and whatever. And so we don't have that, but we do have the foundations of the walls and the floors of the places and the streets. Right there, that is the synagogue at Capernaum. Was rebuilt in something like the 200s, but it was probably built on the same place of the original synagogue of Capernaum, and probably the foundation stones of that church are the same foundation stones. I mean, if we expand the church here, we do it right here usually, right? And so probably the same place. So here's again the city of Capernaum. And here's the synagogue. So you're seeing what an early Jewish synagogue looked like. Okay. So here's a picture again of that site. So the octagon, that's a Christian symbol. The 8 sides, the 8th day. The God made the world in 7 days. On the 8th day, he renewed the world. Sunday, when he rose from the dead. And so that's an important Christian symbol. As I mentioned, they found in these excavations ruins of just an ordinary house that got made into a special place. There was graffiti on the wall saying mostly illegible things, but they found the name of Jesus among those legible things. They also found that there wasn't household pottery found in the ruins, but like devotive lamps. So it wasn't being lived in like an ordinary house, it was being venerated as a holy place. And so this is what they found. The blue is the newer built Byzantine church. The green is when it became a house church prior to that, and the red is the original house that would have been there during the time of Jesus, because it was just a house. This, if you would make it into what it was originally, this is what it looked like: a courtyard with like 3 or 4 houses or rooms around the courtyard. And you can imagine if Jesus is preaching how crowded this area would be. And so if you have a paralytic and there's a big crowded area you can't get through, what do? Oh, you go on the roof and you take off a roof tile and you lower the paralytic down through the grass roof. It says here in the Gospel of John, these things Jesus said, when teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. This is the bread of life discourse. So a newer structure of the synagogue, but probably in the same place as the old synagogue of Capernaum, and probably looked much like this, except a little bit smaller. Okay, now we're moving on to the primacy of Peter, also on the Sea of Galilee. After this, Jesus revealed himself after the resurrection again to his disciples at the Sea of Galilee. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tucked in his garments, for he was lightly clad, and jumped into the sea. When they climbed out on shore, they saw a charcoal fire. Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast." And so, this is very possibly the location that this happened. There's a rock that the church is built around, that there's a tradition that that's the rock that Jesus had the charcoal fire on. Here's the stairs. These are stairs from around the time period of Jesus. And so, if so, it would make sense that this is where the apostles would have docked their boat and walked up these stairs. But regardless of that, this is the region very close in which this would happen, because Peter is not going to go on the other side of the lake to get his boat. He doesn't live there. He lived on this part of the lake. And so we're very near regardless. So here's a video kind of these steps. You'll notice a hole in the stairs. That might have been a place where you tied up your boat when the water level was higher. So I'll kind of show you that hole. And it's right there. You see through it. Okay, there's the stairs. And you'll see kind of a short view of the lake. So that's kind of where the apostles, when Peter jumped into the sea, that's the area right there, and swam to Jesus. And it says they were about, I think it says 100 yards off the shore, so you can kind of imagine that. A picture next to the sea. Now to Caesarea Philippi, another place very special. It's back up way north of the Holy Land, in the area where the Gentiles live, the non-Jews. You'll notice that as we take a look at it. When Jesus went to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it." The word Peter in Greek is Petros. The word rock in Greek is Petra. So just as in English we have masculine and feminine names sometimes, Sean and Shauna, same name, but one's male, one's female. Petra would be the word Petra, it would be female if you left it as Petra, and so Jesus made it the masculine name Petros. And so you could think about it this way: you are rocky, and on this rock I build my church. That's what it would have sounded like back in the day. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. We could translate that the gates of hell. But we'll see the significance of these words regarding the location of Caesarea Philippi when he said those words. So here is Caesarea Philippi, gigantic rock face. This is where the city was. Notice that gigantic cave in the back? That was a cave in which a spring of water flowed out from the depths of the earth and flowed out into this river right here. Since the time of Jesus, an earthquake happened and that cave got filled in, and so the water no longer comes out of the cave. But you can imagine back then, I don't know about you, but I sure would call that the gates to Hades. So here's the cave. Here's what it looks like when there's water in it when it rains. That's pretty remarkable to me. That would be a mysterious place, I would think. If I was a pagan, I would build a pagan monument there, right? Well, that's what they did. This is what it looked like back in the day. This was a temple to the god Pan, and then to the right, the temple of Zeus, I think. And so this is what it looked like in the time of Jesus, and this is where Jesus would have said, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Not a coincidence. This is a very important place in which Jesus said these words. So here's what it looks like now, and here back then. See this niche kind of in the middle? That's what I'm standing in right there. So this should kind of, thinking about this rock face should give you a sense of how firm the church is that Jesus built. Nothing will ever overcome it, even though there may be much persecution. The Dead Sea and the Qumran. Just very quickly, we'll zoom through this. Dead Sea, lowest point on Earth. You float very, very well. It feels like kind of like you're wearing a life jacket. That's how I would describe it. Qumran, the caves, very important. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. A very important find regarding biblical manuscripts. Prior to this find, the oldest Hebrew manuscripts to the Old Testament we had were from around the 8 or the 900s. And so like 700 or 800 years after the time of Jesus. That was the oldest copies of the Old Testament that we had in Hebrew. We had older copies in Greek from like the 400s, but the oldest in Hebrew. So that's a long time. But in the 1950s, so very recently, in these caves in this area, they found a bunch of pots with Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible and many other writings in. They found hundreds of manuscripts from the time of Jesus and before the time of Jesus. And so that pushed back the Hebrew version of the Old Testament we have, pushed it back like 800 years. So that's a big find as far as from biblical manuscript point of view, and it told us a lot about the time period of around the time of Jesus. It was a Jewish area, but they obviously have the Old Testament because it's the same. Okay, Jerusalem. we'll just go to a few places in Jerusalem, and then I'll show you, kind of give you a sense of the whole of Jerusalem. So the pool of Siloam. He replied, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went there and I washed and I was able to see." So this is a man who Jesus healed of blindness. And so he went to the pool of Siloam. Well, what's the pool of Siloam? Well, here it is. They found the pool of Siloam in 2004. It had been covered under mud for years, and they were, I don't know, building a hotel or something. I don't know. And they found it. There's the pool of Siloam. Here's what it looks like. Here, it was a rectangular pool with steps. And so how does a pool like that get lost in history? Well, with wars and battles and plagues and everything that can happen, things go into ruin, things get forgotten about, things get covered up with erosion and mud, and then people don't know where they are anymore, but now we do. The pool of Bethesda, another place in Jerusalem. There is in Jerusalem at the sheep gate a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, with 5 porticos. In these lay a large number of ill. Jesus said to the crippled man, "Rise up, take up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man became well, took up his mat, and walked. So this happened in the pool of Bethesda. Here is the pool of Bethesda. You can't really see that much, and so the pictures we have now that I can show you aren't very helpful, but based on the ruins we have and the knowledge we have of the place, this is what it looked like in the time of Jesus. 5 porticos, if you count these 2 as 1 going horizontal, and then 3 going vertical, 5 porticos. And maybe it didn't necessarily look, maybe these were more connected, and that's why they called it 5 porticos. But anyway, that's the pool of Bethesda. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most holy site in the world, the place where Jesus died on the cross and the place where he rose from the dead in the tomb, because it says he was buried in a tomb nearby. So we got to do the way of the cross on the way to the Holy Sepulchre through the streets of Jerusalem, just like Jesus. So that was pretty cool. Here is the Holy Sepulchre from the outside. Here is the doorway into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here is Calvary. This is the place where Jesus died, and it's protected with an altar and with just the church itself built over it and around it. But you can see in the glass the ground beside it and on it, the rock in which Jesus was crucified. See that big crack in the rock? We don't know for sure when that crack got there, but how about this? Matthew 27:50. But Jesus cried out in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the sanctuary was torn into 2 from top to bottom. The earth quaked. The rocks were split. So maybe that's how that crack got there. Here is the tomb. The tomb that you see right here, it's a modern tomb, not super modern, but it's not the original physical tomb itself. Why? Because in the year 1000, the Muslim emperor at the time, they had tolerated this place for quite a while because they venerate Jesus as a prophet, but this particular ruler completely destroyed it and leveled it. And so we still have the foundations of the tomb. We still have maybe even the floor level of the tomb, I'm not sure. We still have the location, but we don't have the actual cave tomb itself anymore. And that's part of the reality of Jesus coming into our messy world. He came into our messy world with all its messy realities of that things like that can happen. But nevertheless, we still have the location of exact location of the tomb, and I'll explain how we know that. Here's what the tomb would have looked like at the time of Jesus. So you can imagine John and Peter going in there looking and seeing the burial cloths rolled up and that sort of thing. So here's what happened. Here's the history of the Holy Sepulchre. See the orange stripes? That's the original ground. The peak, the rock, that's Golgotha, where the crucifixion would have happened. And then down the hill, down that rocky hill would have been down to where the tomb was, and all this rock was rock. But in order to build the church, they had to destroy the rock around the holy places. They didn't touch the place of the rock where Jesus was crucified. They didn't touch the tomb itself, but they level out everything around it in order to build the church, in order to protect those spots. And so how do we know that this is the location where Jesus died? Very interesting thing. In the year 135, so within 100 years of Jesus, Christians were visiting that holy place. Obviously, it was their most holy place. And so the pagan ruler at the time built a pagan monument directly over the tomb of Jesus in order to discourage Christians from worshiping there. In doing so, he then marked the exact spot of the tomb of Jesus. So then when Helena came in the year 325, they knew exactly the spot where the tomb of Jesus was. And so since the Holy Sepulchre, or since the church was built in the year 325, we've known the location of the tomb of Jesus. And then, anyway. So that's really good historical evidence that this is the tomb of Jesus. Geography of Jerusalem. Here is a model at the Israel Museum, a very large model of the city of Jerusalem during the year 60 AD, so shortly after the time of Jesus. This, you can see what the temple looked like on the Temple Mount. Right now we're standing on what would be the Mount of Olives, looking at the city of Jerusalem. Between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem, there's a valley, and that's called the Kidron Valley. We'll see that soon. But that's what the city of Jerusalem looked like. Again, here's the temple in a more closer view. And we're going to go south of the temple. Right now we're on the eastern side of Jerusalem. Now we're standing around the Garden of Olives, or the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. The temple was huge. Now we're walking south. This right here, south of the temple, is the city of David. That's what the city was like when David was alive. It was much smaller when David was alive than when Jesus was alive. Just this front part near us is the city of David. And as we go around the corner, look, do you see a little rectangular pool right there? That is the pool of Siloam. Note that this model was built before 2004. And so they guessed, they had some knowledge of where the pool of Siloam was, but they got it right, obviously, because that's where the pool of Siloam is. Okay, now we're going to go from the temple north of the temple. Look at there, the pool of Bethesda, right near the temple. The water was used for the temple. That's part of the reason why it was there. Okay, this big center part of the temple that goes up really high, that's where the Holy of Holies is. So that's the place that the high priest could only go in once per year. On the outside, around the perimeter of that, is the court of the Gentiles. That's where the money changers were, where Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Here's the western wall. That is the place that's one of the most holy places for Jews to go now, because they won't go up on the Temple Mount, because they don't know. We don't know exactly where the Holy of Holies was exactly, and so they don't want to step on it, and so they won't go up on the Temple Mount. But this is the closest they can get to the original temple, and so this is where they go to pray. You might think this is the walls of the temple. It's not the walls. It's the retaining wall of the temple. The walls were up higher, but they're completely destroyed in the year 70 AD when Rome completely destroyed Jerusalem. Or they completely destroyed the temple and most of Jerusalem. Jesus said, "You see this temple? Not one stone on top of another will be left standing." Well, to this day, not one stone on top of another is left standing on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So here we're now going to see where Jesus was crucified. So we're going to go all the way around to the back side. Okay, we're going to zoom through, going north. Okay, now we're looking from the north of Jerusalem. We're going to go around the back to the west side, the temple. The western wall is the Wailing Wall. The temple. We're going to zoom in very soon, right there. Zoom in a little bit more. That's Calvary. See the gate? See the crossroads? He was crucified outside the city on a visible place where the Romans wanted to make an example of those executed. And so that's where it was actually a rock quarry. So if you would have seen at the end, you saw a wall outside. And so it looks like Jesus is crucified inside the city. That wall wasn't built until after the time of Jesus. Remember, this is the city of Jerusalem in the year 60 AD, so after the time of Jesus. And so that wall wasn't there, so he was crucified outside the city. So now here's the real thing. We're standing on the Mount of Olives, looking at the Temple Mount. Currently, the Muslim Dome of the Rock is on the Temple Mount. Why? That's the place where they say Muhammad ascended into heaven or was brought up to heaven. So that is their holy site. That is the Garden of Gethsemane, which we'll see later. So you can imagine the tension in Jerusalem where the temple area is the most holy place for Jews, and there's a Muslim church built on their temple area. You can imagine what would happen. Many Jews would want to tear that thing down and build the temple. Well, you can imagine World War III if they would do that. See those tombs? Notice how they're white? Jesus says, your Pharisees are whitewashed tombs. He was very likely looking at those tombs because there have been tombs in this Kidron Valley since before the time of Jesus, because this is the valley of, what is it? Kidron Valley. Valley of Jehoshaphat, which means the place where God will come to judge the dead. And so they want their tombs right there. It's a highly coveted place for Jewish people to be buried. That's the eastern gate of the Temple Mount. Okay, now we're going to zoom down. This is actually the last video I have. We're in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was betrayed by Judas. And see that gigantic olive tree right there? That's one of several very old olive trees. There's a chance that the roots go back to the time of Jesus. They were probably chopped down during the sieges of Jerusalem that happened in the 1 or 2 centuries after Jesus. But olive trees can re-sprout from their roots, and so this olive tree might have been there when Jesus was there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And remember, this happened at Passover, the high feast where all the Jews around the area come to Jerusalem. And so as we turn to look at the temple, you'll see how close the temple was. There would have been singing of psalms and celebrating that you could hear during this very high feast time that Jesus would have been listening to during when he was in the garden. So let's turn around. There it is. That is the retaining wall. See the Dome of the Rock right there? That's roughly probably where the temple was. And so it was taller than the Dome of the Rock, so you could see the temple from the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus was. Again, the Kidron Valley. We're going to turn and we're going to look at the church, which covers the rock in which Jesus presumably was pointing during his agony. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the presentation. Basically, here's what we're gonna do. It's 9:30, so we're gonna stop, and then anyone who wants to go can go. the rest, we can have times for questions. Thank you. Okay, any questions? Yes, Frank. Do I have any plans for leading a trip to the Holy Land? Definitely not in the near future. I'm a little bit traveled out right now, but maybe someday. Thank you. I do recommend it. There are many tour groups from the Twin Cities who go on these trips. You absolutely need a guide in the Holy Land, a local guide. But there are many tour groups that do that, and they go regularly. Groups from the Twin Cities, and so if you want to go, you can go, and there's Christian tour groups that give Christian tours of the Holy Land. So some brochures from Monterey Tours that goes there. So if anybody's yeah, Monterey is a very respectable tour group. So some brochures over there. Next question. Yes. Right.
I don't know my history of the Bible, but can you explain the significance of the scrolls they found in Hebrew? Is that like the first, I think the first scrolls?
So the significance of the Hebrew scrolls that were found in the Dead Sea. So the most of the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew in the year, I don't know, maybe the 200s BC ish. That's when the the Greek version of the Bible, the Greek was translated into what's called the Septuagint. That's actually the one that a lot of the early Christians used because they spoke Greek. Hebrew was actually a dying language during the time of Jesus. People still spoke it, but it wasn't their primary language. Jesus spoke, for example, Aramaic as his primary language. And so the Old Testament was mostly originally written in Hebrew. And so the only thing we had of the Old Testament was translations of the original Hebrew, which that's the way the Word of God works, is it can be translated and still genuinely communicate the truth that God put in it, which is why we can read the Bible in English and receive the Word of God. But it helps us to understand the Bible better when we have the original language. So there were Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, but they were manuscripts that had been written in the 900s, based on manuscripts from the 700s, based on manuscripts from the 500s, anyway, there's my foot. Okay. And so sometimes there's scribal errors. You can imagine recording, hundreds of pages of the Bible, and there's no chapters, there's no punctuation, there's no vowels. It's just letter after letter, line by line by line. Imagine a big wall of text on a page. That's what it looks like. You can make mistakes when you're doing that. And so there are some, that's the importance of manuscript Bible study. That you look at all the manuscripts from all the different parts of the world and you compare those manuscripts and see, okay, what's the original? What's the original? And in many cases, we can find the original. In some cases, it's like, oh, we're still working on this one. What does this word mean? That sort of thing. And that's kind of part of the process of God's revelation, is the church is constantly, the faith is developing but never changing. It's like you plant an acorn in the ground and it develops into an oak tree. It doesn't develop into an apple tree. It's an oak acorn. So it never changes from one thing to another, but it does develop. That's the way our understanding of the faith happens. Same exact faith of the Old Testament and the New Testament, but our understanding of it can develop. But we don't want to abuse that and think that that means we can change it. We can't change it. We can only grow in our understanding of what it has always been the whole time. Yes.
Father, I think too, isn't it true that they found all of the books of the Old Testament there at Sandquist, so including magazines?
If I'm trying to remember, they found all of the books, sections of all of the books of the Old Testament, except Esther, and there might have been except one or two others. But there's also many extra biblical writings they found in there, and many writings from their own group found in there, and many random things like contract transactions and whatever. And so we can't necessarily base our full understanding of what's in the Old Testament and what's not just solely on this find. but it does help us understand of, okay, what did Jews around the time of Jesus believe about the Old Testament? Um, they wouldn't have called it the Old Testament, but Christians call it the Old Testament. Um, so yeah, something like that, but I don't remember exactly. Anyway, Kathy.
We know that there was an earthquake when Jesus died.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an area that's vulnerable to earthquakes, and has there been more since? Or?
Is the Holy Land an area vulnerable to earthquakes? I actually don't know. I think there's some earthquakes sometimes, but I don't think very often. Yeah, I've never heard anything like super special about earthquakes, like they never happen there or they are really frequent. I've never heard anything like that. So I think it's probably a place where sometimes earthquake happens, but they're not that common. That's what I think. I'm not sure though. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Father. The place that you showed where Peter waded up to Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was by the charcoal fire.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the place where Jesus asked Peter the three questions, the three saved questions?
Yes, so the place where Peter swam up to Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, that is also the place where Jesus asked Peter, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep. And that's why the location is called the primacy of Peter, because Jesus is giving Peter charge over the care of the whole church, and that care is founded on love. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. And so I didn't mention that, but yes, that is the location.
And that ties back to Peter waiting outside the high priest's building and denying Jesus 3 times.
It does tie to Jesus' denial of Jesus because first the three, Peter betrayed Jesus or denied Jesus 3 times. So Jesus asked him if he loved him 3 times. But then also, where did Jesus do that? Well, sitting around a charcoal fire. What was Jesus cooking the fish over at the spot? A charcoal fire. So definitely a connection between the two. Mm-hmm.
Wondering if you could share any fruits that you have received afterwards, or how it has enriched your priesthood now that you've been to this
Mm-hmm.
place.
How has it enriched my priesthood? What are the fruits? To me, I think it's just a greater appreciation of of the Bible, of kind of just getting a sense of almost the culture and the just understanding what it was like back then. Even I didn't mention a lot about this, but just even experiencing what Jewish life is like, even modern time Jews, really helps you to understand the Bible better. Like for example, we don't really hear anything about the Sabbath day, but over in Jerusalem, all the shops close on Friday afternoon, completely closed until Saturday evening. They mark the day from sunset to sunset. And the life just changes there. Even the elevators in the hotels, there's the Sabbath elevators, and the Jews aren't allowed to do any work, like even press any buttons that light lights. It's kind of weird, but anyway, even the elevators, they stop at every floor because the Jews aren't allowed to press buttons, and so they just go in the elevator and they just wait a long time until they get to their floor in the hotel. And it's just a really like laid back, relaxed day, and like it's really a day of rest for them. And so even the Christians live kind of that way on Sunday there. It's we kind of lost that in our culture of the Sunday as the day of rest, the Lord's Day. But there it's so prominent that you just really get the sense of what the Sabbath was like. For example, even the Old Testament, what the Jews, they collected manna for 2 days on Friday, so they had manna for Friday, and then God didn't want them collecting manna on Saturday because that was work. And so God gave them a double portion of manna on Friday so that they would already have manna for Saturday, the Sabbath day. And so just kind of experiencing that there, like really, like gives a new perspective on the Sabbath, and that's the type of life that Jesus lived. We even hear in the New Testaments, on a Sabbath day's journey away from Jerusalem is Bethany. Well, a Sabbath day, that's a limited amount of time that you can travel on the Sabbath. Otherwise, beyond that point, you're doing work. Um, and so I don't know. Just there's many different ways in which I got kind of a better sense of the life of the early Christians and the Jewish people of the time that helped me understand the Bible. So I don't know. That's what comes to mind right now. But
Father, do you have, give me a little information about the walls of Jerusalem, how old they are, and the gates?
The walls of Jerusalem and the gates. So some of the walls you saw were walls from the time of Jesus and before. Some of the walls you saw were built many years after the time of Jesus, even up until, I don't know, like the 1800s and that sort of thing. And so some of the gates are the original gates and some of the gates are new gates. And so as far as which are which, I don't know. I don't remember.
Is there any conversation or any indication where John was baptizing in the Jordan River?
Yeah, any indication where John was baptized in the Jordan River. We don't really know which part of the Jordan River that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. I don't think we don't know. There's several sites that you can go in the Jordan River for baptisms, but we don't know which is closest to the original.
Stuck on the trees today. But, do you have any sense of the ethnicity of the three kings? You mentioned Persians a couple of times during your talk. Tell me about that.
The ethnicity of the three kings. We know they're magi from the east. I think that's all we for sure know. I think the early Christians or early-ish Christians, I think they saw them as Persians because they had some contact with Persians, and so when they, made that mosaic in Bethlehem, they did it with Persian clothing, and so were they actually Persians? I don't know. I've heard theories that they were from Babylon. I think I've heard, but I don't think we know for sure.
And I guess at one point the Persians did overtake Babylon.
Yep, Persia was the powerhouse of the Middle East at one point in history. Yep. Rod?
Father, would you share with us, I imagine you have a bucket list that God willing in your lifetime, there's other religious sites you'd also like to visit. What's on the list that you want to share?
Other sites I'd like to also visit, religious sites. So, one place that I did not get a chance to visit in the Holy Land, mostly because it's in Palestinian territory, which, because of the tension, this is a not commonly visited place, but it's Jacob's Well. So, what I really like about Jacob's Well is that it's like a really small place that we know with high confidence that this is where Jesus was and this is where Jesus sat. It says he was at Jacob's Well in Samaria, and he talked to the Samaritan woman there. Well, famous wells like Jacob's Well, they don't move. They remain put. And so we have there's this huge rock that there's a well in, and it was an important enough well to be famous during the time of Jesus as the well that Jacob made. And so we know with confidence that this is where Jesus sat. It says he sat. He was tired, and so he sat at Jacob's well. And so we can go to this well and here it is. But unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to visit Jacob's well because of the location. So it's in a church right now, but haven't been able to go there. So that would be a cool place. Outside of the Holy Land, so I spent a semester in Rome, so I've kind of already seen pretty much all of the most important places in Rome. So, I mean, the only other biblical places I can think of would be like Greece and where St. Paul went, stuff like that. But nothing else comes to mind. Maybe I'm forgetting something important.
Okay, and you probably said why, but I forgot. You said Capernaum was your favorite place. What was it?
So I would say Capernaum is one of my favorite places for sure. I don't know specifically. One, I just like the Sea of Galilee. Two, I like the really strong historical confidence we have in the location. So those are kind of my top two reasons I really like Capernaum. But yeah, the most of the Holy Land is busy and kind of messy and crazy, but the Sea of Galilee is really nice. So I like the Sea of Galilee a lot. It's more like the peaceful experience of Jesus versus Jerusalem now, as it would have been back then, just crazy city of commerce and people trying to sell you stuff and all that. That would have been the same back in the time of Jesus. So maybe one more question, if there are any. Mm-hmm. The Wailing Wall is the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. Mm-hmm. Yep. The Temple Mount was completely leveled, and then now the Dome of the Rock is built up there, and some other landscaping stuff is built up there, but nothing above the retaining wall has exists through history up to this day from the original temple. And so that's why we don't even know we don't know exactly where the original temple on the Temple Mount was. There's probably in the middle, probably on that part, but we don't know for sure. All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.